If you're a god or goddess in ancient Mesopotamia, how do you prove that you're an adult? By having a baby. In this video, we look at the myth Enlil and Ninlil and consider the way in which the gods' reproductive capabilities show that they are fully fledged members of society. Like, subscribe, come along for the ride. Hello everybody, welcome back to our series on sex and eroticism in Mesopotamian literature. This is episode 10, Enlil and Ninlil. Teenagers never listen. So last video we left off with a reading of the myth that's treated in this chapter of Gwendolyn Leick's book. Now we're going to dive a little bit deeper into some of the interpretations of the myth and look and see what Dr. Leick has to say about it. We're going to briefly look at the summary of the myth for those that don't remember the reading that we did. We'll consider previous interpretations, what other scholars have said about it, look at it as a coming-of-age story, which is Gwendolyn Leick's interpretation, consider its comparison to another myth, Enlil and 𝀭, look at the importance of conception and fertility, and finally consider a possible ritualistic purpose for this text. The summary of the myth. Ninlil's mother warns her to stay away from the water because she says that Enlil will see her and, quote, "He will make love to you, and when he has happily filled your womb with fertile semen, he will leave you." That sounds like a lot of fun for everybody, I'm sure. And as teenagers are wont to do, Ninlil does not listen to her mother's advice, goes down to the water anyway, and things proceed as her mother warns her. Enlil sees her, wants her, says he wishes to kiss her and make love to her. Ninlil initially protests and says that she's too young for such activities, her lips do not know kissing. They have sex anyway, which results in Enlil being banished from the city. He tells Ninlil not to follow him, and she follows him anyway. And at various points he disguises himself as different officials in different parts of the city of Nippur, which is where this myth is set. Each time she comes across one of these officials, Ninlil asks where Enlil is. The official, Enlil in disguise, protests that he doesn't know, he hasn't seen him, and Ninlil uses the fact that she is pregnant with Enlil's son to assert her own authority over this official, who then swears allegiance to her, and they end up having sex again. This happens several times, each time Enlil impregnates Ninlil, and finally the text ends rather abruptly with a bit of a hymn of praise to both deities, who are hailed as Father Enlil and Mother Ninlil. Previous interpretations of this myth, Leick gives quite succinct overviews of various other scholars' views on it. She starts out with Jakobson, who views Enlil as a sex offender on the grounds that he raped Ninlil, and says that he's banished to the netherworld because of this offence. And Enlil's response to this banishment is to make children with Ninlil who will then take his place as substitutes in the underworld. Kirk notes similarities to the myth 🀭 and Ninlil, which we've also covered in this series, especially the importance of fertility and problems that arise when fertile potential is wasted. Behrens looks at Jakobson's argument and says that there's absolutely no reference in the text to this idea of substitution, and instead links the existence of so many sons to the concept of fertility. And finally, Cooper investigates Ninlil, specifically, something that doesn't happen so often, and argues that she shows a typical ambivalence of the victim towards the oppressor, kind of like a Stockholm syndrome here. Leick views the story as a coming-of-age myth. She argues that this shows the transition of Enlil and Ninlil from adolescence to adulthood. This transition is shown through their ability to create children. Enlil's ability to impregnate a woman, and Ninlil's ability to conceive a child. Unlike the myth of 🀭 and Ninmah or 🀭 and Ninlil, this particular story is set within a cultural context, which means that there have to be consequences for Enlil's actions. She argues this is the reason why he's banished, although it's interesting here that if the story is set in a social context and there must be consequences for the actions of these two characters, it's interesting that Ninlil apparently does not face any kind of repercussion for extramarital sex. In fact, apart from Enlil being banished, the two of them actually end up at the end of the myth with far greater status than they had before, which Leick argues is as a direct result of their fertile potential. They both proved themselves as productive members of society by their ability to both impregnate and conceive. This is contrasted by Leick to the myth Enlil and 𝀭. Very similar setup. Enlil sees the goddess 𝀭and wants to have sex with her. The text diverges drastically from the pattern set in Enlil and Ninlil, however, because 𝀭flatly refuses and goes back into her parents' house. And as a response, Enlil gathers all of these wedding gifts and ends up asking her family if he can marry her. So she appears to have followed the more appropriate path for a young woman. But as I said, even though this is the socially accepted manner in which relationships between men and women should happen, there's still no hint in Enlil and Ninlil that Ninlil was dishonoured at all by her actions or by Enlil's actions. And interestingly, 𝀭and Ninlil both end up in the same position. They're both married to a supreme god, the same god in this particular case, and have increased status both in the position of a married woman, but also as queen to Enlil's king. 𝀭achieves her status through restraint and respectability, while Ninlil achieves her status through fertility, intelligence, and persistence. Even though Enlil effectively runs away and tells her not to follow him, she follows him, she's persistent, she conceives several more children in the course of the myth, and as a result is given this exalted status as a mother goddess and as the wife of Enlil. As with the rest of the myths that we've looked at in this series so far, there's a massive emphasis placed on the fertilizing powers of male semen. Instead of the female character being viewed as the kind of like the fertile partner, the woman is really only a receptacle for the male sperm, which is what creates the child. Although, having said that, the fact that Ninlil is able to both conceive and to conceive multiple children at the same time is apparently enough to claim authority over the officials as Enlil's partner, and shows her worth as a full-grown woman, not an adolescent, which is how she's described in the beginning of the myth. Finally, there's also a possibility that this myth was used for some kind of ritual purpose. Unlike the other myths we've considered so far, this actually takes place in a concrete, real location. It's within a city, hence the social setting and the consequences of one's actions. But the fact that actual locations in the city were named in the text suggests that it may have been used for ritual purposes. And even though Enlil is seen less often as a fertility deity, this is normally a role reserved for the god Enki, Enlil's role as the city god of Nippur, Leick argues, would have given him a place in local fertility rites. So even though he's not usually associated with this kind of sexual behaviour, it's still appropriate in this context in his city. In summation, Leick sees the myth of Enlil and Ninlil as a coming-of-age story. The god and goddess here prove their status as fully fledged adults through their ability to procreate. They go from 🀭, that's the Sumerian word meaning young or small, to adults in their own rights, able to procreate. And finally, the myth may have been used in a ritual setting at Nippur. Next time, we will look at penis envy, or phallicism in Sumerian literature. And remember, until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that?